Good afternoon, guys.
Hey, Dave.
Great to be with you again.
Nice to be here. Absolutely.
We covered some great stuff in our last segment. I have to ask you, do you think people are drawn to hear about the struggles of the early years? Is that a common thing that you have to answer for people?
All the time. I think people are drawn to anybody's struggle, you know. I mean, that's why they have shows like Behind the Music or...
They're drawn to anybody's struggle.
They are.
Okay.
Yeah, people like struggle. And I think when you get the background to somebody's story, that's what's really good. When your mom and dad tell you stories of growing up and you find out it wasn't always easy, it's always interesting.
Stories old people like to tell.
Well, when our last segment ended, we left you on the day that you bought the American Dream. And it started with a little bit of drama on day one, right? You end up having to fire Sam. You had this new partnership and you borrowed a bunch of money to buy the business. You found out you couldn't use the phone number to American Dream, so you had to start rethinking things. That day ended, and then you woke up and said, "We got to figure out what to do now." What was that next day like?
You know, that was both Sam and us. We weren't smart enough to figure out that we needed to write those into the contract. The attorney didn't suggest that, and Sam knew it but didn't say anything. None of us were responsible enough in that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, then the first day, the alley didn't have good drainage from the North Avenue behind us. So when it rained, that would all come down and flood. That was the day after we bought it. So
seriously,
it was raining, so we went in and we have that picture of Tim Larank and Steve Shimmer shoveling wet sawdust. And
shoveling scoops of water and wet sawdust into a trash can. And us just trying to unflood the place. So our first day we were flooded. Sam was gone. We had no phone number. We had a year, 11 months or 10 months before the yellow pages come out again. Maybe we had a couple orders. I don't know. That was the first day. It was a shambles. And you know, a place looks bad when it's flooded. It looks really bad. You see a picture of a flooded home and you're like, wow, what a disaster. And so when you have a place that's maybe a little bit dirty to start with, and it's a little tiny shop that's dingy and made out of 2x4 benches, and then you add 2 inches of water to the bottom, it just looks like you got nothing.
Were you asking yourselves, what the heck did we just get into here? Did you feel the weight of responsibility, and did that hit you immediately?
No, we're excited.
Yeah?
We're excited to get started.
Yeah, let's clean this mess up and try and make a guitar. Yeah, I mean, it was like, oh my God, what's next? But I didn't feel a weight of responsibility. We were responsible. We
had a lot of that
still.
that came
We're
later.
19. Do you feel a weight of responsibility at 19?
A few years later, when we had bills, a couple years old, we couldn't pay. I felt the weight of it.
Definitely. But then we were flush. We had some money.
When did it happen that you knew you had to change the name? And how did you arrive at Taylor? And what were those discussions?
We weren't Taylor first. We were Westland Music Company.
And what was the thought behind that name?
We thought we'd do all sorts of things. We weren't focused just on making guitars and building a guitar brand. Because, I mean, how could we? You know, we would do repair work. We'd make a few guitars. We used to buy mother of pearl inlays and purfling from Vitali Import Company. So we thought, oh, maybe we'll get into that business. We'll, import our own inlays from Germany and purfling and distribute them ourselves. So we thought we'd do all these different things. Well, we'll do, we'll have a retail shop and we'll make guitars. We'll do repair work and we'll sell inlays. And we're going to be the biggest in the West. So we're going to call ourselves Westland Music Company.
What would have been on the headstock of the guitars?
Well, we didn't really consider we were a guitar maker yet. I mean, we knew we were going to do that.
Yeah.
And, we were making custom guitars for people, even our American Dream guitars. This one that's in the background here says American Dream, but the rest of them didn't. They just had nothing on the peg head.
So the first guitars we were making and the guitars you were finishing up after we bought it, since we couldn't use American Dream, what did you put on the peg heads?
We never put anything on the peg head, even when it was American Dream. But we had American Dream labels that went inside, and we put those labels on the inside.
Were there a few that had American Dream on the peg head?
Yeah, like this one here. Okay. Early, when Sam was cutting that out. But all the American Dream guitars I made, I never put American Dream on the peg head.
That's right.
And I can't remember how long it was before we decided that we needed a name on the guitars. It was within the first year, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and we agree that Taylor was a great name for an American-made acoustic guitar. It was as good a name as Martin. And so we didn't have a hard time deciding on that.
No. I mean, our other choices were Listug and Shimmer if we went with a surname. And so, and I was the guitar builder.
And he was the guitar builder, yeah.
So it worked out. I mean, we approached it on tiptoes. It wasn't hard for us to get there, but at first we didn't know each other. We wondered if, there was going to be egos involved and that type of thing, but I'm pretty easygoing on that. And
it was a pretty easy decision to make.
I would say so. And so we started making some Taylor guitars, but I think maybe at the exact same time as that is when we went out to try and figure out how the wholesale business worked. Don't you think that was in the first year? Remember, we drove to Claremont and went to Balboa Music, you and me. We walked in and asked them. A little strip mall store, long, narrow.
And I think is that the store that bought one guitar from me?
In San Diego?
Yeah, there was a guy in San Diego bought one guitar. They were kind of I'll help you guys because I feel sorry for you. I'll buy one guitar and maybe it'll help you pay the rent. Those are the early sales. It was in '76 that I first started going to music stores after, visiting a couple stores in San Diego. Remember Tony Zerola?
Yeah, I do remember Tony Zerola. In fact, he's even showed up a few times in recent years. Yeah, he's still the same. Okay. He's onto a new thing that he is and he's interested in, but he's still the same Tony. And who was
these people that used to come and hang out,
Yeah. When did you first sell to Harper's Music in Chula Vista?
Oh my God, it would have been
80s.
No, it would have been in the 70s.
Yeah, I wonder if they bought a guitar because they felt sorry for you. It was 74, so we had 6 years.
They went to St. Mark's Lutheran Church, where my family went growing up. So, they thought they believed in what we were doing and wanted to support us.
When did Cactus buy a guitar from you at Valley Music?
Oh my God, Valley Music in El Cajon. It was that period before I started going up to LA.
Yeah.
Selling a guitar to Cactus and Harper Music. And
I think that they were their first sales. I don't really think Balboa Music bought a guitar. They had
there was one store in a mall. I don't know if it was them or somebody else. I can't remember.
It could have been them. We walked in and asked them how it worked. We were shocked. We were like, "What? You buy guitars at half the retail price or whatever?" And oh my gosh, how do we? Well, our guitars had gotten up to costing $400 or $450. We were starting to hone in on maybe I made the first Scallop Brace 810 in 1978. It was a guitar I made for myself. I still have that guitar. Before that, 76, we had the 800 series.
Yeah, we went through that period of developing the first guitar that we thought would be a model. And Jerry Pike was trying different things. And the 810 was the first one. We're like, okay, that's going to be a standard Taylor model.
How did you land on 800 as the series for your very first model?
We sat around and talked, and we conceived this idea of the series, the 800 series. It would allow us to go up and down, and we thought maybe we would probably go down more than up from there. We could always add a 700 and a 600 and a 500, so it was just a concept. And we eventually had to add a 500 and a 600 and a 700.
Yeah, we'll get to the Rothchild days, but we added the 700.
Jeff Stelling bought one of those first 810s. Do you remember? We had one.
I remember, yeah.
Languishing, and we needed money. We had no money. And Moneybags Jeff, which we called him because he had started this business, and these guys, banjo was real popular. It was the bluegrass days in 75 and 76. When did Deliverance come out? 1973 or 2, right? And then that movie, they had the soundtrack that had the Dueling Banjos song in it, and it was popular. I heard that. I think I was in 11th grade. I thought, I have to learn how to play the banjo. I got to learn how to do it now. Maybe I was in 12th grade, senior in high school, and people were buying banjos, Jeff's banjos, and Greg Deering and Janet Deering were working there. They were a subcontractor working in Jeff's shop. And people would come in, like they'd show up from Japan and they'd pull out cash. He'd buy him a banjo. He'd put a couple $1,000s in his back pocket and they'd move on. And I think for some reason, that 810. And I think we got $470 something dollars.
Yeah, he helped us a lot when he bought that.
Yeah, that got us through.
Yep.
A little while.
So it sounds like you had other ideas for revenue that eventually you had to abandon, and it was guitar building. Was it? Was that a sudden realization that you had?
Yeah, we came to that realization, but we didn't think in terms of revenue. I mean, we weren't that sophisticated.
You're thinking
yet.
of eating.
Well, I remember when we were figuring out who was going to buy the shop, I went and got some books from the Small Business Administration, and I was reading them. And this is so funny to think about now, but it was so, a high percentage of businesses that start fail. They don't make it through the first year, a couple of years. And here are the reasons why. And it was like insufficient sales. And I'm like, really? Wow, insufficient sales. I mean, that cost. I didn't even know the cost.
Like, I'm tracking with you, Professor.
Yeah, I mean, that was a new concept of insufficient sales. They were like that. Not enough working capital. Things like that. And the one of them that really stuck with me that helped us grow the company was talked about understanding using term debt for fixed assets, not spending your working capital on fixed assets, and then not having any working capital to buy and sell inventory. And that stuck with me. And that's how we grew the company. Basically getting term debt to finance fixed assets, making sure we had plenty of working capital. Came from that stupid little book that I wish I still had.
Yeah.
Valuable.
Would you say that it was a year and a half or 2 years? Remember, we sat down with Steve and we said, we're not going to do these other things. By then, Kurt and I thought the same. Really easily, we thought the same.
Yeah, it took a while because we'd be interrupted by people coming in to hang out, do repair work. So, that was risky to shut the doors and just concentrate on making guitars because we knew that was going to be the future. So we'd be shutting the door to some sales and cash coming in. Mm-hmm. And yes, Steve didn't agree with that at all, but he wanted to, be the Vitali import company and do all those other things. And we're like, we're never going to get anywhere if we do that.
Yeah, we have to focus. We have to put our heads down, decide what we're going to do. Let's make some guitars. We'll sell them through retail stores. We'll sell them wholesale. How are we going to make a $450 guitar and sell it for a wholesale price and take basically no money for it? Or how are we going to make that $450 guitar worth $550 and then sell it for half of that? Right. Mm-hmm. And maybe we can take less for it and make the guitar worth more. And by then we're looking at other guitars that people make and going to some music stores and seeing what was out there. And we started focusing on that. We really did. And those days when it took us a long time to boot people out of our factory who would come and literally spend their whole day, 3 days a week, hanging out at our shop. Don't you guys have something else to do?
And Tony Zerolo was one of them. He was a guy with a cowboy hat, a great big guy like that, and he'd play guitar, and he was huge, and he'd like to get Bob and get him up on his back to crack Bob's back.
Well, he'd been in some kind of industrial accident, and he had a limp. And he got workers' comp money or disability money from the state. And then we applied, and the state paid us money to train him how to make guitars.
I forgot about that.
Remember? And so I think we got a couple $1,000s over a period of time from the state of California to rehabilitate him into ability. And so we had him around, and I was teaching him how to make a guitar, and we got some state funding, and that was our money. We would have never done that if we didn't have to. But then he pretty much had keys to the place.
So, he had a bona fide reason to be hanging out. And then he's like, we're trying to figure out how we're going to sell these guitars. And he's like, well, I can sell your guitars. And so we had these little business cards made up that said J.A. Zarola, sales representative, and I still have one on my desk. And so he took a guitar and he went to Allen's Music Center in La Mesa, tried to talk him into buying a guitar, and got pissed at him because they weren't interested and came back. And that was his career, selling our guitars.
So would that have been one of the first batches of guitars rolling out in 1975? That would have
very, very early on. Yeah, like within the first year, I'd say. Yeah. First year and a half.
Who were those early customers that would have purchased those guitars back then?
It was just people that
Locals.
would mostly come in.
Yeah.
I remember putting a few ads like in the Daily Aztec or like the Reader to try to, attract people to come in.
We started hanging guitars on the wall. We put some Pecky cedar on the wall, you know what I mean? Hung guitars on there. And people would come in to buy a guitar. And then Kurt went out and braved the stores.
My friend Dennis McLean had this idea to paint this mural on the wall. So he and a buddy painted this mural like this guitar. It was like a flying V-shaped spaceship cruising
across the landscape
space,
of Jupiter or something.
Jupiter and all that. That was on our wall. And we thought, that's cool. That'll help us sell guitars.
That was 1976. It was pre-Rothchild when at the closing of a day, we were getting ready to go home between, 4:30 and 6. This guy walks in and he wanted to know about having a guitar made. And his name was Charlie C., and he was the grandson of Martha C. from C's Candy. And he was fixing to go to the Alps to go skiing, and he wanted a little guitar. Okay, so I talked Kurt and Steve into letting me build that guitar on the side.
And he bought a guitar that we considered a blem.
And he bought a guitar that we considered a blem, and he ordered a guitar. And I made that little guitar. It was a fancy little guitar. It was a jumbo shape. It was real small. And I made that guitar on the side, took the money for it, and it helped me get married in June of 77, right? It was a little bit of money to help me have some money to get married.
Yeah, and we'd been selling guitars to stores in L.A. at that point. And to be able to sell guitars in L.A., we needed cases. And so somehow I got hooked up with Geib cases. They'd moved out from Chicago to some industrial area in LA, and it was Nick Geib. And so they would make us cases. And then John Levy was a music industry executive that worked there, and I think he did wholesale sales or something for them. He told me some dealers to go see. He said, well, you need to see Fred Walecki at Westwood Music. He likes having the latest thing to show people. And of course, McCabe's Guitar Shop and Studio City Music. And so he gave me some leads to go up to LA. And he said, oh yeah. And he said, your neck feels good. And, he said the problem Martin guitars have always had, they have a baseball bat neck. So here's the guy that's been a music executive forever telling me that, I'm like, okay. So then we got some guitars done, and I used Bob's van, I think, his orange van. Went up to L.A., called on Westwood, sold him a guitar. Went into McCabe's, sold him a guitar. One of them I might have sold a couple guitars. Went to Studio City Music. And they were guys that would make like bass fiddles and cellos and things in Studio City. They weren't really a guitar dealer, but they also took pity on me because here we were trying, and they wanted to help, so they bought a guitar. All these places wrote checks. So then I drove back. Bob was living with his sister Georgie, and so I pulled in that night, and it's like, got checks.
I was blown away. I was expecting him to come in and go, man. I went up there, visited some stores. There were some people that were interested, but not right now. But if I go back next week, maybe they'll have thought about it. But instead, the van was empty and he had checks.
Yeah.
And we're like, what?
This works.
Really?
That was a happy
totally
moment.
just like,
yeah.
man alive. We made guitars, and Kurt went up and turned them into money.
Yeah.
Money is so much lighter weight and takes up so much less space than guitars. You can do things with it. It was unbelievable.
That was in 76, and McCabe's is still a dealer to this day.
Kurt, what were your early pitches like?
I just go in and say, here's who I am. We're making guitars. You want to check it out?
And they'd feel sorry for you and buy a guitar.
And they'd play it and they'd like it. They'd always like the neck. And they liked the guitar. And it was a little bit lesser expensive alternative to Martin. And they thought they could sell them. So they'd buy them.
You know, Charlie C. came in after Fred
He'd seen him at Westwood.
And so he bought a guitar we had on the wall, and he ordered a guitar. And since we had a dealer, we gave them half of the sale of the guitar that we sold on the wall.
I don't know if we were originally going to do that or not. Remember Fred saying, you know, here I am showing your guitars. That's how Charlie found out about your guitars. And then I think we made some kind of accommodation.
Yeah. Well, it ended up being 2 guitars. And so we got more or less the wholesale price of 2 guitars.
Yeah.
Or maybe it wasn't 2 guitars. Maybe it was 1 guitar. I thought he ordered 2. He ordered a fancy guitar, bought a guitar. But it could have been that the next guitar we sold them, we deducted money from what he owed us.
I think so.
We squared up with him.
That was in 76. Then in early 77, when the Grammys were happening in LA, Fred called me and said, hey, Waylon Jennings just came in. He's going to be performing at the Grammys, or he's up for an award. And he liked your guitar, and he offered to endorse the guitar in exchange for the guitar. And we talked about it. We're like, wow, this could be really a big thing for us, but we really couldn't afford it. And so we decided that, well, there will be more opportunities in the future, you know, to do things like that. And we really needed the money, so we said no.
Even though he was good-hearted, man. You know,
yeah, he was a big deal then. I mean, they had that Outlaws album with him and Willie Nelson, and I forget who else, Jesse Coulter, and
that was a big decision to say, not now. Yeah, not ready. How influential was Fred for you guys in that whole scene up in LA?
He was the guy then. I mean, he would all the bands that were big would come into his store and he'd help them, and he'd have like their touring cases right in the window when you drove by, like the Eagles, you know, stuff like that.
Little River Band.
He was super connected.
John David Souther.
Yeah, he was super, super connected.
He was very connected, and those people, I think you could do. You could fill this room with Linda Ronstadt, Jackson Brown, aged people when, you know, in Laurel Canyon, that music flowed down through David Geffen and Herb Alpert, and all of that whole music scene was starting to happen. And all of those people would tell a story of Fred Walecki giving them a guitar and saying, just pay me overtime, bring me in some money every week, go out and do some stuff. I've read so many stories. I mean, all of them would go, Fred Walecki supported us. And so he's beloved by the musicians that started the whole California folk rock.
Kind of the Laurel Canyon scene.
The Laurel Canyon scene. Mm-hmm. And so he was great. And he liked us. He showed us his stuff. As we started to grow, we felt like he lost some of his
He liked to always have the latest thing.
Something special that he had.
He'd keep moving on to discover the next latest thing. So,
but he was a great guy and a huge part of our...
So he helped us early on.
Really supported.
And he had a fellow there working named John Carruthers, who was a young repairman who took care of these people and fixed their guitars. And I learned things from John about guitars. I went up there a couple of times and visited that, and we'd talk, and he helped me. And late, you know, I lost track of him, but sometime, I'd say 10 years ago, he showed up at NAMM shows and started talking to me, and we reminisced about old times. And he was a custom guitar builder in LA at the time and doing repairs, restorations, and building custom electric guitars. He was a great person. He was real influential. And who was it, Jack? At McCabe's?
Jack McKenzie.
Jack McKenzie.
I was in touch with him last year. He's been a fishing guide in New Zealand forever. And he contacted me through customer service because he had someone with a Taylor guitar that needed some work and wanted to understand how our neck joint worked. So Glenn helped him, and we sent him shims and the whole deal.
Yeah, he really believed in us. And McCabe's would buy guitars, and they would sell them. And I would say, I mean, I think we were in business 25 years when we looked at each other and said, you know what? McCabe's has never sent back a guitar once. even if our guitars had problems, they would fix them. They're like, we'll handle it. They move on.
And John Zender was the repair guy there. He passed away years ago. But
yeah.
A big long beard. So we started selling to the stores in LA, but we were trying to establish ourselves, and very quickly, just the few guitars that we made, we didn't have enough orders for them. So, and then Whittier Plaza Music, remember them, sold to them. And
I don't know when Fred House at Covina
Fred House Covina, that was after Rothchild. Yeah. And so then I did a trip up to the Bay Area, opened a few dealers there, but it was clear we weren't going to be able to get out and open enough stores. And then I got together with Fred, and Fred said, well, you probably need some reps. So I went up and had dinner with Fred, and he called Phil Halsey. Remember him? He was like our first rep after Tony Zarola.
Wow, I've totally forgotten about
Phil Halsey. And so Phil Halsey became
I can see his face right now.
Our sales representative. And it was funny because Fred recommended to Phil to sell our guitars, but then Fred never ordered another guitar from Phil. And Phil was just baffled because here Fred had recommended, to help us take on our line, but Fred never bought another guitar after that point. He moved on to the next thing that he wanted to pioneer.
Mm-hmm. Fred reached out to me 3 or 4 years ago, and then I reached back, but we didn't hook up. He got throat cancer and he'd lost his voice. He was talking through a thing like this, but he reached out to say hello, and I've got a real warm memory of Fred.
Yeah, I had an email exchange with him, I think pre-pandemic, just a couple of years ago.
Really?
He had an artist he wanted us to work with, and passed on the information to our artist relations people.
Meanwhile, we had bizarre happenings back at the ranch, learning how to make guitars. So we're talking about selling right now. But I remember people would come in and look around. I remember one day some guy came in and he had a note from an attorney, and he's contacted his attorney because he wanted to sue us. He wanted $1,700 because we stole his idea for a side bender. And I'd made some, mold to wrap sides around. And he thought all to himself, I didn't even know who the guy was, but once evidently he was in our shop once, and we talked, and he decided that we stole his patentable idea. These things would happen all the time that would just shock you.
When you're small and struggling, there are people like that, the opportunists, try to take advantage of you.
Like the guy that came in one day with this gorgeous, sexy girlfriend who was dressed to make you look at her. And then they wanted a tour, and we're giving them a tour. And then he disappears and she continues on the tour. And then later, after they left, we started getting checks that were forged with the name Kurt Taylor on them. And they would write these checks. They'd gone in, taken our checkbook, and he was pulling checks out of our little office while we're giving her a tour through our little tiny shop.
Several pages down, so you would notice they were gone.
And they would write checks.
They were pros at doing that.
Wow.
And they stole, I don't know, $1,000 from us or something.
Oh, man.
Oh, these things, like every day was some kind of story like that.
Yeah. How long did it take you to burn through your initial investment? Did that
couple months?
Couple months.
by the end of the first year, by the end of December, starting mid-October.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Martin was a supplier to us then. They were very kind to us. They had a sawmill during those days. They had just built a sawmill. They had a nice Breda resaw. They were buying logs from India, sawing them there. And then all of a sudden, you couldn't buy logs from India, but we bought sets of wood from them, and they sent it to us on credit. And it was 76 that we couldn't pay that bill. And the reason I remember is because in 77, that's when I went to go visit Augie, the Prinzi, before a show. No, it was the show. Yeah.
Well, we had to start doing business with Rothchild.
Yes.
For you to have met Augie.
Yes.
Right. And that happened in 77.
Yeah. So that happened in 77, and that show was in New Orleans. So actually, it was a year after that when the show was in Chicago that I went to visit Augie. It was my second. No, it was not in New Orleans. It was Atlanta.
The first show you went to was in Atlanta, right? And that's where you met John Larrivee and Augie.
Yeah, and then it was the next year that I went back there, and I went in, and I went in with Augie. I went to Martin the first time. I was looking around, and some guy says, "This is Bob Taylor," and it's like, "Hey, you owe us money for wood," you know.
You're the guy that hadn't paid us. Linda Davis, was that the gal with Sawmill?
She worked there up. She retired about 4 years ago.
So I think the bill was $1,200.
Yep.
That you owed Martin Guitars.
And it was years before we could pay it.
They wrote it off. But Kurt sent him a check one day, years later.
And my mom, who would help out, she'd come in and answer the phone and stuff. She was so excited when we got to pay some of those bills. You know, Mom was someone that, like a lot of moms, had to have things to worry about. And, she'd worry about us and how we're doing and whether we're going to stay in business and make it or not. So that was a big sign of prosperity to get to where we could pay some of those old bills. Because we had bills for quite a long time. We had bills that were 2 years past due that we just couldn't pay for several years. Yeah. And that was one of them.
And we weren't paying ourselves either. We were making no money.
Right. Yep.
There was some years before we paid ourselves anything. It's a little bit foggy, when I try and put everything in perfect linear order of what happened first, second, and third during 75, 76, 77.
But you're out of money. That's a tough go. What are conversations like between you guys just day to day? That's pretty discouraging. How do you keep each other?
I used to hate it when Kurt would call me into the office. Bob, we need to talk. And then he would say, if we keep going like this, we're going to be out of business. I'd be like, oh, man. I would just get this adrenaline in my heart, like you just got caught doing something bad, like my whole life's going to come apart. And he would just lay it on the line, and then we'd figure out how to make some money.
Yeah, my dad would do the books, and eventually I learned how to do the books. And we'd give ourselves a draw, which you do when you're a partnership. You're not on salary. You give yourselves a draw. And we were basically... we were undercapitalized and weren't making any money. We were drawing the money out of the business. Mm-hmm. That's what Bob's referring to. So, and my dad would, I'd get that from my dad, not all the bad news, but basically, well, here's how it is. And I'd be like, and then I'd have to talk with you about it.
But then there came a time when I started thinking, I remember sitting down and saying, you know what, there's things that we buy that we could make. I'll make them. We buy little abalone pieces to make I'll make the rosette. We buy this. I'll make that thing.
In your off hours.
I just make them.
There weren't off hours.
They weren't. Yeah, we had no off hours.
You'd work all the time.
We worked all the time. We worked 6 to 7 days a week. I don't think we came in necessarily every Sunday, but we ended up there on Sundays.
And work at night a lot. I remember coming in at night to resaw spruce in the tops.
Yeah, and we clocked in.
Mm-hmm. We had to keep track of our hours just to be disciplined.
We had time cards from I don't know if it was day one, but probably from the end of month one, we put time cards and we would keep our time. We'd clock in, we'd clock out.
That's a way you could be accountable to each other as well. Just telling each other, I'm in this just as much as you are, and I'm here to get it done.
The Eagles, Linda Ronstadt, Jackson Brown did a concert at Balboa Bowl on a Saturday. I loved the Eagles. And I remember talking Kurt and Steve into letting me have a Saturday off to go do that.
Do you remember when it seems like it was a train came through and stopped in Lemon Grove and it was full of oak? Mm-hmm. And you went out and bought a whole bunch of oak?
Me and Gary Anderson bought some, and I built furniture with it.
Then you built a bunch of furniture. And was that the thing you did on the side to make money, or was there another thing like that where you got a bunch of wood and made some stuff to be able to make some extra money?
Well, there's a few things that I did to make some money. I needed to buy an engagement ring for Cindy, and there was a ring with a 10th carat, diamond in it, and it was sold at, what was the name of that sort of catalog store, Duncan or something? They had one in Grossmont Center, and you would look at the catalog, and then you'd go to the store and say, I want this thing. It would come down a conveyor belt. And I think it was called Duncan's was the name of the store. And it was $179 for that ring. And there was a guy the guy that owned El Amigo restaurant was redoing a restaurant out in Bostonia, which was on East Broadway in El Cajon.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted corbels all the way around. And somehow he learned that I had a big bandsaw and could I cut those corbels. And so I made like $200 cutting those corbels, working like 2 full weekends in a row. Was able to buy a engagement ring. And then there was an old fiberglass bowl back from those days, when Greg Deering had made a mold and we made some Ovation kind of copies. Yeah. And I put one together and sold it to a friend. I would make a little bit of money like that.
They call that a side hustle now.
That side hustle. Why? I would hustle, come up with a little bit of money so that I could live. Because I wasn't living at home. Kurt and Steve were still at home. There was a way to make $100 here and there,
Through all that, were you still having fun building guitars?
I loved it. Yeah, I love it today too. I love it.
What part of building was the most challenging back in those days?
I would say making a straight neck, easy to play guitar, the right neck angle, flat fingerboard. That was challenging. I'd learned some stuff from John Carruthers and John Larrivee about doing that, and it turned out to be fret the guitar last thing, build the whole guitar, and then when you're done, put some tension on it. It's like, in other words, refret the guitar. Because if I had a really crooked neck, I'd yank the frets out, sand it flat, refret it, and I'd have a good neck. So like, why even fret it? I'll just do a refret the very first time around. I made one of my side hustles a little bit later was I made Fender replacement necks for a musician's friend.
Oh, yeah.
When Rob was right in El Cajon. Yeah.
Wow.
And I went over there and hung out with Rob and the guys, and we looked around and they're like, we want to sell these necks in our catalog. It was just a little tiny place, right? And I go, I'll make you those necks. And I made the first one with like what we would call Rich Light today. It was a black synthetic fingerboard. And I made some tools. And I think I made them 100 necks. And I did that as a side hustle.
That's my former employer, Rob
I know.
Eastman.
I knew you'd brighten up when I said
Yeah,
that.
and it was the predecessor to Musician's Friend. It was Musician's Supply.
Musician's Supply.
It was Musician's Supply, not Musician's Friend when I did that.
Oh, that's great.
They were right there in El Cajon, not very far from where Taylor is.
Yeah, and I remember they're young guys, Rob and I forget.
Al.
Rob, if it's, and my
and Bud was still around and would, you'd hear from him and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's a small world.
Isn't it really?
Ours.
It is, because Bud Eastman had started Guitar Player magazine, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So that was some money. That was a little bit later. That's when we were also selling to, who was in Garland, Texas? What was
Arnold Morgan.
Arnold Morgan.
And that was the early 80s.
Yeah, when we get
70s.
to there, that was a wild ride. That was the first dealer that, did a great job. Yeah.
So let's touch on the Rothchild relationship.
So we went up to, I was going to LA starting in 76, and then I went up to the Bay Area, and we needed to make more guitars to try to make a living. And we got into this thing where we thought we didn't understand finance yet, or, the economics of making a profit. So we thought if we made more guitars, we could get profitable, even though we weren't making money to begin with and didn't have the cash, the working capital to make what we were already making. So we embarked on that, had a bunch of young guys working for us, dug ourselves a deeper financial hole. And then we got a call from Paul Rothchild, who with his brother Ed has started a little distribution company. And their idea was that there are some guys making great instruments that don't have the resources to get out and, call on music stores and get enough distribution. And their products were basically a little bit underpriced. So they thought they could be a distributor and take some of the margin without impacting what we were getting, because the retail was too low. That was what they presented.
Boys, your guitars are worth a lot more than they're selling for.
So it was, do they have a limbic?
Had Alembic. They had
Furman Sound.
Had Furman Sound. They
Travis
had
Bean, I think.
No, it wasn't Travis Bean. It was Oasis.
Oasis guitars.
He used to work for Travis Bean.
Okay.
And he was making an aluminum neck too.
Larrivee, did they do Larrivee?
Larrivee, Augustino, Dwarf Amps, which was the competitor to Pignose.
Okay.
Right? So it's Dwarf.
Bartolini pickups.
Bartolini pickups. That's where we met Bill Bartolini.
Yeah.
And so there was, San Francisco people, John Larrivee, and then Augustino guitars, which Agostino Laprinzi had started Laprinzi guitars. And when AMF bought, what happened? CBS bought Fender, Norland bought Gibson, and AMF is like, wait a minute, what's this? People buying music? Okay, we need to buy someone. This little company was starting to do okay. So when Mossman Guitars was doing okay, I remember sitting at that very first show that I went to, and I was the only one that went there, and I had to come home early. And Stuart Mossman was sitting there drinking hand, and he just signed a big distribution deal with Cajon Musical Instruments from Japan. And he's like, well, me and my little, they paid me money for my little old $1 million company, and I'm just like looking up like this, and John Larravee's in business, like, little old $1 million company. Wow, man, I'm not worthy. And I couldn't even stay. I had to leave that cocktail party that was in a hospitality suite in 77 and run back home. But Agostino, it didn't work out. And his brother Tom sort of took over the Laprinzi name. And so Agostino started that. And that's where we got that. So there was 3 acoustic guitar makers and 2 electric guitar makers, Oasis and Gary, I can't remember his last name,
Gary Cooper,
who owned Oasis. His father had some money, and I went up and visited their shop, and I'd never seen anything like it in my life. Boy, they had machines. It was amazing. They're up in the Bay Area, Sacramento, I think. Mm-hmm. My eyes were like saucers when I would see those factories. Look, I just looked at factories this last week, and my eyes were like saucers with some of the things I saw. It's the same.
Yeah. So they came down and they made their pitch, and I'm like, I think Bob was willing. I was like, nah, I don't think so.
But this is Paul Rothchild.
Paul Rothchild.
He was a producer for The Doors, and Janis Joplin.
And I had those albums, and I'm like, this is the same guy.
He's a real guy.
He's the real guy, yeah. So first we said no, but then, a week or 2 went by, and it was kind of sobering. We didn't have other prospects, so I thought, well, what do we have to lose? Let's give it a try. So we called them and put together a distribution deal with them and had a contract and got started. And
we started selling boxes of guitars with no cases, 8 guitars in a box.
That's right. We'd make the plywood, buy the plywood. We'd make the cases, ship them up there. And he'd call to give a sales report because they had their sales reps around the country. And he'd call and he'd go, goose eggs, meaning zeros, nothing sold, which then led to that we needed to lower our price to sell to him. And then we needed guitars that would sell for less, the 700 series, the 600, the 500. I mean, we started going down that path, not making any money. I got to know him a little bit, went up to his house. He had lived on Lookout Mountain Road up in the Hollywood Hills. He'd had a little house that Harrison Ford had built him before he made it as an actor because he worked as a carpenter. Yeah. And I was interested in Porsches. That's the first time I'd really ridden in a Porsche because Paul had a 67 911S that he loved. So I went up there a few times and went out with him to hear bands playing, that he was producing albums for. And met John Sebastian at his house one of the days I was up there. So, here we are, just kids, totally broke.
Totally kids. And just to put things in perspective, we received our most expensive guitar was the 855, and we got $370 to make that guitar. That's what we sold to Rothchild. And we worked our way down. The difference between the 600 and the 500, they were both mahogany guitars at the time. And the 600 had 3 plastic rings in the rosette, and the 500 had 2. And maybe there was some satin on it. I can't remember. But we got $150 for a 510. We made a 510. One time I was really frustrated because a dealer was calling. They had one of the repairmen call me because there was something wrong with their 510 and they were griping. And I go, do you guys do refrets? And I go, yeah. And I go, how much do you charge for a refret? And they go, well, 125. And I go, well, I got 150 for that whole guitar. Do you think that you could just file that fret for me and call it a day?
Oh, man.
You know, but those are the years that I say I quit. That's when I learned to not make love to a guitar when I made it. Let's get this thing done. I'm gonna get this guitar done. There's not enough money in it for me to like fool around. I've got to make tools. I got to figure out how to get this thing done, right? I wasn't getting any money for them.
Yeah.
Was that a tough lesson with the 500 series? You needed to build a less expensive guitar, but really it didn't cost that much less to build it.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing because, you know, probably people who buy guitars will be listening to this, but a lot of people, they'll say, well, I just don't know why this guitar that you make, why is it worth more money? Like, how can you charge more for that? And I go, well, actually, it's the wrong question. It's like, how can we charge so little for this guitar? Because our company started at the 800 series. That's what we would have to make any money. And then we learned how to make a less expensive. When you buy our least expensive guitars, you're getting the most value that you can get. And we always say, even today, I tell people, our least expensive guitar has to be our best guitar because there's no room in there for something to go wrong. No matter what you make, people expect it to work. It literally can't afford a warranty repair or a trip back to El Cajon. It's not expensive enough. Yeah. And so we learned that in those early days. Those Rothchild days were good for us. That was like the teacher who whacked your knuckles every single day and turned you into something. And we turned ourselves into something because they opened dealers that we couldn't have opened. And it taught me through survival how to get it going, get going.
Yeah, we got a network of dealers out of it that were successful selling our guitars, like selling our guitars. In those days, the NAMM show, the Winter NAMM show was in the Disneyland Hotel. It was before the NAMM Convention Center. So Rothchild would have a booth. We're very proud to be part of that. At first, go up there. There's a picture in the Taylor book we did several years ago where I'm standing there and it's like a cover of Rolling Stone. That was that NAMM show in Disneyland Hotel. And Rolling Stone had a booth there. So it'd be us and the other companies they were distributing. And
we met people. I became friends with John Larrabee and Jim Furman and
Michael Gurian. I remember his booth. I remember walking by and seeing Diane Magana talking with dealers. And I'm like, God, they even have like professional salespeople that are, she's like friendly. It's like they're friends with their dealers.
Yeah, like how does that work?
Yeah.
Agostino Laprinzi and John Larrabee, they told me things that helped me learn to make guitars.
Yeah.
And, Furman, Jim was a roadie for the Dead, the Grateful Dead, and he was making power conditioners for them, as I remember. Yeah. And then his company took off, and he came up with parametric equalizers. We knew him. And, Jim went along and had a sex change along the way and became Janet, but I think it was about 5 years ago, I reached out to her and I said, hey, how you doing? She's like, well, man, I've been following your career. And she came down and she's in her 70s and I'm in my 60s.
That's cool.
But it was awesome. And I gave her a tour through the whole factory and she's like, wow, she's like looking at every machine and doing all this stuff. And it was just wonderful connecting with these people that we knew back then. We went up and we got to know Ron and Susan Wickersham at Alembic, and we saw this. Right. I mean, these guys are making guitars.
We met Rick Turner.
Rick Turner was from Alembic, and we've been friends forever in the guitars that he made. Those days, we met people, and they're true blue friends to today. So it's really amazing.
There was a lesson that you learned early on, and maybe it was Augie Laprinzi that really hit you with this, and that was to get away from the batch building mentality. There's this inherent logic of, well, if we just set everything up and do this one process over and over again and then move everything else through to the next process, how important was that for you to realize that one guitar that was built and shippable was
life-changing? Life-changing. We had a show in Chicago, probably was 1978, And so from there, Augie lived in New Jersey, and before the show, I arranged to go home from the show with him and visit his shop. So he had a house, nice house. He's a grown-up man, you know. His career was that he was a barber. And he joined the army and he could cut hair. And this general's go like, "You're with me." And he took him and he gave haircuts, right, to the general. He got through the whole army and that. And then he came out and he opened a barber shop and he had like 10 guys working for him cutting hair. And then people would come by and start jamming. And he started repairing guitars in the back room. And they started making guitars. And then musicians came by because they wanted a musician's haircut. And that turned into Laprinzi guitars, which eventually became...
I mean, they put a bowl on your head.
Yeah, that's what they did, right?
Beatles.
He could cut your hair a little bit, your sideburns a little bit longer, make you look cool. And so I went and he had a house in the backyard. He had this shop in the back of his house. And I was looking at all the stuff. And I'm making guitars in batches of 10. We're going to make 10 guitars in a month. And 4 of them would get ruined along the way. So we'd finished 6 guitars in 2 months. You know, I mean, it wasn't... We didn't just do half what we wanted. We did a fourth of what we wanted. And we never could make money. And I was watching and he had like a guitar here and he got there. And I said, "Well, when you make your bridges, how many do you make?" And he said, "Well, I make 1. If I need 1, I make 1." I go, "Well, that's not how I do it. You know, when I make bridges, I make 10. I make these guitars in batches." And he's like, "Well, it works a little bit better."
Because you're going to save on all the setup time.
I could save the setup time. I could save the setup time.
Yeah.
And, you know, here I am, young and unsuccessful, and there he is, older and successful, but I'm arguing with him, tell him how to do it. And then he just looked at me and goes, "Bob, what would you rather have? 1 done guitar or 10 half-done guitars?" Boom. I went home and it's like, we're not making 10 guitars a day anymore.
Yeah, I remember Bob coming back from some of these trips. He's like, "Oh, here's what I learned. Here's what we're going to do now."
You get a download.
Yeah, totally. Just like we had a download yesterday, right? From a factory tour he did. It would be a similar deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's just like I went out and I saw some stuff, and I'm bringing this back, you know, because I'm friends with guitar makers. Our story is this could easily turn into a guitar selling story. Kurt built our brand and he built our sales, and I built our factory and built our guitars, and this is the true success of Taylor Guitars. Mm-hmm. And so it's both of these stories going on at the same time. He also built our very fine financial habits, right? And so we both got good at that. Now I sort of have a sense of how to make a guitar to where there is some finances to count, you know, but we both learned things.
Model.
Yeah, and you come back. Even this week, I came back and got the whole E-team together. It's like, I want to debrief with some things I saw yesterday. And we make decisions based on some of those things. Sometimes it's wind in our sails.
Yeah, it's really helpful when you meet with people and you're really encouraged by what you see. And it's sort of like opens several doors for you into the future. Mm-hmm. You know, when you're trying to make decisions about what to do. That was my takeaway from what you had to say yesterday.
Yeah.
That's how I felt like with Vitro. I've always felt that way. I'd meet with them, I'd be excited and hopeful. Like, wow, here's how we're going to get there.
Kurt found a local marketing advertising firm, Vitro. We're still there, you know.
This happened in the 90s.
Yep.
And he came back and he's like, "I think we could do this with what I learned today. I think we could sell guitars. I think we could market guitars." He'd just be
here's how we're going to build a brand. You know, we knew we'd have to build a brand. We'll get to that later. That's quite a bit later.
So you understand that you want to build this brand, and Bob, you're feeling the responsibility to build enough guitars to meet the demand that may be created through.
We got to build the brand. They're like the front force to be able to sell more guitars. Mm-hmm. You know, they're making people like what you do even before they go out to shop for a guitar.
Yeah,
to know about what you do.
And we're going to build more guitars anyway. We just do. We just plow ahead. We've always plowed ahead. We reiterated that yesterday.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Some I thought of kind of market intelligence we'd get. It really came from McCabe's guitar shop about people wanting pickups and guitars.
That's right. And treble in their sound. Do you remember that day?
And treble and also pickups. Those all came from early on with McCabe's. And what were the first pickups we used? Marcus Berry or something?
Marcus Berry pickups.
Then I remember we went to Lloyd Baggs, and because of our relationship with the Bartolinis, Bill Bartolini designed a pickup, a preamp to go with the Baggs pickup that we installed.
That's right.
Yeah.
The first visit that I went up with Kurt, maybe the second, or maybe he'd been there 4 times, but I went and visited the McCabe's guys there. We like these guitars, but could you put more treble in them? I remember I could see myself there. I'm like, okay. And I went home and did some stuff, and we came back. Came back again, and they're like, wow, there's more treble in it now. This we could sell. And it's kind of interesting when you think of Taylors now compared to traditional Martin sound. You know, our guitars are more of that cut-through type of sound. There's more brilliance to them. And they asked me for that. I don't know how I did it. I'm a pretty good guitar builder. I'd say I'm a pretty good guitar builder. I figure out how to make the stuff, and I had a pretty good design, and I had high standards. Compared to Andy right now, just parenthetically, he can think of what he wants in a guitar, and he knows how to get there. I always say it's like Beethoven writing music when he couldn't even hear. Right. Yeah. Andy's that way. Me, I would try things, and I got there, and then they were telling Kurt pickups. Kurt would come home and go, pickups, Bob. It's like, I have one word for you, young man, plastics, but it would be pickups. And we got that. And one time I remember a review in Fret's magazine or something like that. And they said, Taylor Guitars, comma, a reluctant supplier to the acoustic electric guitar division or industry, comma, I would say we did it, but we weren't digging it. Mm-hmm. It was hard, but nobody else was doing it except for Ovation and Takamine.
Yeah. Also from Fred Walecki early on, he told me that our guitars were a little bit dark and could we brighten them up?
Really?
So that came in. I passed that along to you. So that came from him and then from McCabe's.
Mm-hmm. Well, we brightened them up, and guess what? It made a second sound. There we had a second sound. We had like a log to burn off the other logs. And we had a neck that could play. We had a guitar sound cut through. We had action that was low. And these guys sold guitars to electric guitar players.
Yeah, and we learned how to put pickups in them and cutaways. Mm-hmm. And look at how far we've gone with that.
Right.
With responding to the market.
Interesting to see what the genesis of that was. I didn't realize that. What about that guy named Neil Young that bought one of your guitars early on? What did that do, and what didn't it do for you back in 77, 78?
Got us pretty excited.
Man, I remember going down to the Pacific Cinerama to see Russ Never Sleeps.
Widescreen.
Mission Valley,
70 millimeter. Mm-hmm. Russ Never Sleeps. I hear he plays his 855 in that. And I go down there with 3 or 4 buddies, and they're all, whoa, Bob, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm just leave me alone. I don't want to get all excited, and I don't want you to look at me, and I don't want to find out it didn't happen. And now I owe you an apology because he didn't play a guitar. It's just like, I'm real uncomfortable. And they're, doing that kind of stuff. And finally he walks out and he plays that guitar.
There was that big picture inside the back cover of Rolling Stone of him playing it.
Yeah. And so what it did for us is it gave us wind in our sails on a personal level. And I always say, and then the next day we went back to work and we had to make guitars and try and sell them.
You need those little things to keep you going.
It's still like that today.
Yeah.
When you see an artist play a Taylor, you go, oh, that's
totally is. And he got it from Prune Music in Mill Valley.
Yeah, that's right.
That's where he bought it. And then he bought a second one. I heard this was the Rothchild days. He was on a boat off of Miami, and he'd called someone to locate another one. He wanted to back up.
Yeah, didn't he get from Thoroughbred Music or someone like that?
Or Ace Music in Miami or
maybe
somebody like that who wasn't around anymore. So yeah, those sightings would be one of the things that would keep us going because we were broke and it was hard and we didn't know if we'd ever get anywhere. But
Midnight Special, Wolfman Jack, I'd call Kurt at 1 a.m. I go, Fire Falls on TV, and they're playing, they're on Midnight Special, and they're playing that jumbo with the redwood top that we made for Fred Walecki.
Yeah.
ABBA's on TV and Bjorn is playing in 8:15, you know.
And then I think even before
awesome.
Rothchild, so much happened. It seems like just in the first couple of years, it seems like there was so much history because it was so hard. This gal came down from Laguna Beach who wanted to sell her guitars internationally, named Ushi Eastman. And it was E&E Instruments International, and her husband sold medical devices. He was the other E, and she sold musical instruments. And what she would do, she would buy them from us at an extra 15% off dealer wholesale, and then she would sell them to distributors in Europe. She was basically focused on Europe. So one of these nights we're watching TV, and we had known she'd sold a guitar or two to Benny England in Sweden. So here comes ABBA playing one of our guitars. We're like, whoa.
That was awesome.
Yeah, I was like, you got to be kidding.
So they would show up on the midnight special.
Yeah.
And you'd wake each other up.
Just amazing. Yeah, we'd call each other. It was just mind-boggling.
Yeah, those sightings. They're amazing.
When did you guys decide to pay yourselves?
How many years was that?
Well, we paid ourselves something and used up all the money in the company so that we couldn't pay ourselves anymore.
Then we stopped.
And then we didn't even have gas money. And I remember when we'd write ourselves, during that period, we'd write ourselves a small check. And I'd run out of money. And I had a credit card that I got from Sears. The same thing happened with Barbara. They had a program to help people establish credit, like young folks. So you'd get a credit card with maybe a $200 limit or something. So it's the only credit card I had was Sears. And I would be broke and I'd have some money hopefully coming the next week. So I'd go over to Sears in El Cajon and write a check for like $50, and they wouldn't cash it for like a week. And then I'd make sure that I got the money in my account before that check would bounce.
I remember going to Rid Out Plastics to buy some plexiglass so that we could make a jig. And I spent $15 and something cents and wrote a check, company check. And the guy was like, let me call on this check. And he's doing this. And I'm just like, oh my God, just make sure that check is. And then he's like, no, hangs up the phone. Looks like it's good. And I'm just like, oh shoot.
Yeah, you'd always wonder about that. Or going down to, was it D&D Sawworks?
Yeah.
To pick up bandsaw blades.
Oh, that
they were the nicest people.
That was Sakari.
They were the nicest people. And the lady would be like, could you look after that one bill? I don't think we've got a check from you yet. And I'd be so embarrassed. They were down on 14th Street south of Market or something. They were down on 14th Street south of Market or something.
Yeah, it was somebody knife sharpening. It wasn't D&D. The man's name was
it wasn't
Sakari.
D&D.
What's that?
It wasn't D&D.
Yeah, I'll think of their name in a later episode. But husband and wife, little Scandinavian man, they'd sharpen our
little
stuff.
blade sharpening
and
business.
very gently, kindly remind you that you had some past due.
But yeah, we would be overdrawn. We would bounce checks now and then. It was horribly embarrassing. You'd wonder if you were going to get found out that you'd written a bad check, and we couldn't pay ourselves anything anymore. And finally, Bob came to me and Steve one day, and he said, we have to pay ourselves something. Let's just decide on what we can pay ourselves every week.
Develop the habit.
No matter what, and then we'll increase it by $5 a week until we can't increase it anymore.
So where did you start?
So we all agreed on that with $15 a week.
Not a day. $15
a week.
Every Friday, and it's like, but I want we have a bad habit. We're waiting for the world to be good before we get money. Well, when's that ever going to happen? Yeah. We have to develop a new habit.
Yeah.
And I worked hard. I want my $15, dang it. I want my $15.
It's just like how you have to establish a habit of saving. You can't wait till you have extra money.
Right.
It's the same kind of deal.
So we got our $15 the first week. We got 20 the next week. We got 25 the next week. We're patient. All the way up to $85. And there we sat for 3 years.
Yep.
Sometimes we couldn't cash the $85. We have to wait a few days because we knew that it wouldn't go. And that was that 85 to 300. Then we sold guitar. We started selling to Musicians Supply.
Yeah.
And we had those guitars for Arnold and Morgan. But anyways, we skipped from 85 to 300 one day.
So we were doing business with Rothchild.
Yeah, back to Rothchild.
And we go to the NAMM shows. And after a couple of years by the show, I think it must have been 79, we'd had a few shows. Bob went up there first to the Disneyland Hotel. And
Pre-show day.
And he called and said, man, things are really bad. Things are really bad. We're going to have to move away from Rothchild because they weren't selling our guitars. We weren't making any money. They were late paying us, right?
Their idea wasn't working.
The booth
it
was
wasn't
clearly indicative of a
wasn't
business
working.
in decline.
And they had a sort of a all-hands meeting in San Francisco, maybe a month before that, where we all came up and they're like, give us a chance. We're going to make this work. But everybody came. All the suppliers walked out. It's like, they're not going to be able to pay us.
Yeah.
Right.
It wasn't working. Then Bob and I caught our Southwest Airlines flight back from San Francisco, and we're going down the runway to take off. And Bob's like, shifting. Here we go. Third gear.
We're still kids. In between all of the stuff, we're still acting like kids.
We were really young. So he called me and said, hey, this isn't working. And we knew it wasn't working. So we made a decision to have to end the relationship with him. And we took care of ourselves first. I made sure that I got paid for some stuff that they owed us for. And I think we had guitars they sent back for repair or something. In other words, I got us in the best position we could be in. And then he was on the set doing the movie The Rose with Bette Midler. And I had the number and I called him on the set. I reached him on the set. I think it was Paramount, I'm not sure, and told him that, we're going to have to end the relationship now. And he was shocked, of course, but,
It was dramatic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we went on.
And we were kids, too. We had to tell him that. And he was in his 40s. I mean, he was a grown-up.
An adult.
He was a grown-up.
Yeah.
He was twice our age.
Yeah.
And then the very next day, we started getting the wholesale price of the guitars, not the distributor price.
And we gotten all the owner registration cards we'd been getting for the warranty. So we knew
Brilliant.
the dealers. We started getting on the phone with the dealers.
Yep.
And then we laid off all those kids that had been making guitars for us. We were making too many guitars. We weren't making money. So we laid them off. And then we had probably the best summer we've had in a long time, you and me and Steve, just finishing up all the guitars that had been started and shipping them out.
There was 300 guitars that had some various form of something going on.
And calling the dealers and introducing ourselves and getting to know them. So a lot of these dealers we do business, that's how we knew Mike Moody
Just had lunch with him a week ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All
Birmingham, Alabama. Moody's Music.
All over Arnold Morgan Music in Texas.
And believe it or not, Dave, I even had my quota of dealers I had to call in those days. And oh man, that was rough.
So let's back up. Let's pause there for a moment. This is very interesting because this is a lesson in the importance of working capital. You have too many guitars in various states of build, and you have this realization that we've got too many people supporting this, building too many guitars, and you've got 11 people. You've got to let 8 of them go, and it's back down to the 3 original partners again. That's pretty heavy.
We didn't have the working capital to even make those guitars. We were misguided, thinking if we made more guitars somehow we'd make money. We just didn't understand how it worked. So we'd gone into debt to offset it. We made these guitars into the money. We racked up a bunch of debt. So then, as we were selling off these guitars, we were then able to pay the bills and eventually get current on everything.
Yeah. One day I made an analogy to myself to make me understand. And I said, okay, let's pretend I'm a contractor, a successful one. I'm doing fine. I do patio remodels. I can build your patio, get it done in 2 weeks. I go to Dixie Line Lumber. I buy the stuff. I put it up. You pay me. I get some deposit. And I'm successful. Does that mean I get to bid on the new convention center? No, I don't. I'm a contractor, a general contractor's license, but I don't get to bid on the convention center because I don't have enough working capital, right? I don't. And so to me, it was like, okay, this is actually really easy to understand. We're not big enough to make this many guitars. One day we'll be big enough to bid on the convention center, but we're not today.
Yeah.
And we just simplified it. And so we started actually gathering in all that money that we had out with guitars that were started and guitars that were finished and unsold. And Kurt was spending his time on the road driving. He'd put 3 or 4 guitars in his trunk and he would leave.
Yeah, that's when I started those trips. And I would do, I don't know if it's 1 or 2 week trip. I started doing this loop where I'd go out to like Phoenix area, New Mexico, throughout Texas, up to Oklahoma, and then back. Remember Neil Cronenthal, the guitar shop, Scottsdale, Arizona?
Mm-hmm.
He was one that started selling our guitars, Rothchild days.
Remember when we got down to about 100 guitars and we were selling to Arnold and Morgan Music. They were in Garland, Texas. They were a big store that was 2 brothers that owned it. They had taken over from their parents who had started it. And there was Jack, remember?
There was Johnny. With the beard and the long hair. Johnny Lane.
Johnny Lane, and his boss was Jack somebody. You might think
there was Dan Halbrick.
Dan Halbrick. It wasn't Jack. It was Dan Halbrick. Yeah, mm-hmm. It wasn't Jack. And then Larry Morgan. Mm-hmm. And his brother Gary, maybe something like that. And it was 2 halves. It was the piano and band and the orchestra stuff, and then the MI, what we call. Mm-hmm. It's funny that guitars are musical instruments, but pianos aren't. But MI over here, and they were selling our guitars. And you know what? There was a store that was well financed. They had working capital to buy stuff, and there was a couple people who believed in it. They had a great salesperson, and you know this to be true. Salesmen sell guitars. They really do. Mm-hmm. Salespeople can sell a guitar if they believe in it. And we just struck it rich with them because they were moving our guitars.
Yeah, they had sold our guitars in Rothchild days, so that's another where we followed up.
Yep.
With owner registration cards. They started selling our guitars. They started selling a lot. They couldn't get Martin. Someone else had Martin tied up. They were a big store at the time. This is, you think, around 1980-ish, doing $13 million a year.
Yeah, think about that.
That was a pretty big store. So they liked our guitars. They got behind our guitars, and they were good salesmen. They'd buy a lot of our guitars. I mean, they treated us like we were a major line, even though we were teeny. And they'd have guitars on stands there, and someone would come in the store, and they'd put one of our guitars in their hands. Here, try this. Feel that neck. And they really helped put us on the map as a contender.
And we needed working capital, and we were dwindling down those guitars that we had. And Kurt was out on the road, and I remember calling. Maybe you remember it the same way, but what I recollect is I called and I said, Kurt, we need to do a big sale of these guitars and just get a bunch of money because we're going to dwindle down to nothing. And we're going to have no working capital. There could be a big thing here. We could actually give a discount and get a pile of money. And then with that, we could have some maneuvering room. But if we keep going the way we're going, we're just going to run out. And then we're going to feel like we have to start all over again. And I'm not even sure how we're going to buy gas. And so I said, I'd like to offer 75 or something guitars to Arnold and Morgan at a discount. And he's like, okay, you do it. I think maybe you call. Finally, I had to drive that deal home. And I said, look, I'll come cook your Thanksgiving dinner if you buy these guitars.
Yeah, before that, though, when we were wrapping up all the guitars from the kids, I forget the circumstances, but we sold a whole bunch of guitars to, Musician Supply. Uh-huh. And Arnold Morgan found out about it, and Larry Morgan called. He was mad about the whole thing. Oh. Remember that?
Yep, I do now.
Yeah. Uh-huh. I don't remember if those were Blems or if they were a bunch of 410s, which was or what was it, a 510, our entry-level guitar at that point?
Yeah, 510, no, 400s were Santee.
So did we sell them a bunch of those at a discount because we needed the sales or something? Mm-hmm. To Musicians supply.
And
I
maybe
think
we were wondering about it, and I advocated to do it so we could get some money and we could figure out how we could start over.
I think we did, and we got the money from Musician Supply, and then finally we were able to get completely current on all the bills.
We paid off everything. We had a brand new day. We had a little bit of money in our pocket, and we were many years in business by then, and we're making $85 a week. And I went out to Arnold Morgan, and we had like a Saturday big sale day, come meet Bob Taylor kind of a thing. I mean, I'm still, what am I, 27 years old or 30 or something like that? But that doesn't seem to matter in the guitar world, you know? And we sold guitars that day and shook hands, and it was good. But it gave us a chance to start over. And it was probably, don't know when we decided to change our partnership and buy Steve out. So that was 8 years into it, so I can't remember.
Well, we had that period where we split with Rothchild. We started with them in mid-'77, and Paul gave $100 to your church as a Christmas present.
Mm-hmm. Wedding present.
As a wedding present. And I think we only lasted through till early 79, which would have been 2 NAMM shows. And after that NAMM show, so, you know, spring, February, March of 79 is when we split with them. I started doing my sales trips and did that for a couple of years. And things continued getting more difficult with Steve, because you and I would always see eye to eye on things, and he didn't. Mm-hmm. He wasn't there with us in terms of, you know, the decisions we were making.
Was it a shared goal for you guys to always grow the business and build more guitars? There was never a thought that, we need to stay small because guitars made by small companies are better. Was it always?
Our ambition was to grow, but it wasn't really Steve's, because he wanted to still do kind of the Vitali import thing, and he wanted to do the books. And
Steve had a hard time letting go of something that wasn't working. And Kurt and I were more, well, let's focus and do it.
Let's focus on the future, what we see as the future.
But I mean, I was friends with Richard Hoover at Santa Cruz then, and John Larrivee was growing. He was making a lot of guitars.
John Larrivee helped us a whole lot, but there would be times where we wouldn't have tuners or things, and Bob would call him, and John would just send him flats of tuners to help us get by. I mean, he was extremely generous.
Yeah, as a competitor.
He was extremely generous.
I go, what about your 12 strings? He goes, I'll worry about mine later. Let's take care of you. Here's a little story. I like making tools. Schaller mini tuners used to have 2 screw tabs on them, not one.
That's
and
right.
so we would spend all this time lining up tuners, right? And then drilling the holes and putting the screws in. So I made a jig that just clipped on the back. And we had a whole batch of guitars, a dozen 855s that were all pre-drilled. Here comes our tuners, Schallers from Coast Wholesale. We open and there's 1 tab, not 2. And I started calling all over the world, and there was no 2-tab tuners. So I had 12 ruined necks with 6 holes in it and no tuner to put on it. That's when I called John. I go, do you have tuners with? He's like, yeah, I got some in stock. I go, we need like 20 sets.
Mini tuners.
Yeah, mini tuners. I go, I need these because, and he's like, I'll send them down. He goes, I got 12 strings to make, but I said, well, what about yours? He goes, don't worry about mine. I'll be fine. Let's send these down and get you going. Yeah. There's a lot of moments in life where somebody helps you over a hump.
And even,
you know, today this guy came in, I went to buy a burrito, and this guy comes in and he almost looked like a drug addict. I mean, he was so like this, and he's like, please, I'm so hungry. I was like, I'll buy you a burrito. And then he sat there and ate it. And I was with Scott Paul, and Scott goes, that was really interesting, because by the time he looked like crazed, but by the time he got food in him, he wasn't crazed anymore. And at the end, I walked over and I said, is that enough? Where are you sleeping? I'm living down in the corner. I go, well, you want a burrito to go? It's like, yeah, okay, give him a burrito to go. And you go out, and it's like, those little things are like getting some tuners from Johnny.
Mm-hmm. It's just like Joe Pesci needing a Snickers bar.
That's what I was going to say. That was the
Just had low
analogy.
blood sugar, and
I was thinking.
yeah.
No, it's really interesting. Just those little things sometimes make the biggest difference in a person. You know?
Just a little kindness and generosity. There was also a period because we used to buy tuners from the wholesalers in the early days. We didn't have a direct relationship, so I remember even going down to Blue Guitar and buying some tuners to put on our guitars so we could ship them out. They did say Court on the back of them, but we put some Court tuners on our guitars even.
We did put Court tuners on our guitars.
Whatever it took.
Did what you had to do.
So those couple of years they were fun. Getting out of the Rothchild, had enough dealers out there. I'd go out and start traveling. I'd take the Volvo. I was in an accident up in LA on the beginning of a trip. I ended up having to have that car fixed. You loaned me your brown Volvo, for one of those trips. And things were getting worse with Steve. We were trying to get on a system where we'd be making guitars every day, starting guitars every day, carrying them through, finishing them every day. And when I was making guitar bodies, which is up until 1982, it was that thing till you come in the morning, you get this body made, then you're binding the one you put together the day before, that whole thing. There'd be a bottleneck in the finish because Steve didn't work according to that kind of system. He wouldn't want to come in and work on that kind of a system. And it kind of comes down to people, they go into business for themselves. What do they want out of it? Maybe they want to come in a little later or work later and have their own work schedule, but you can't blame somebody if they're in business for themselves. But the little company we were creating didn't work that way. We couldn't get the guitars made and shipped out and collect the money unless we were much more disciplined than that. So we went through a lot of years of, Bob really having to lean on Steve to get the guitars finished every week so he could string out so we could ship them by Friday and then end up getting checks in the mail a few weeks later.
And if they didn't get done, you'd stay late and finish them yourself?
Yeah, a lot of frustration. Yeah.
There were a lot of Thursday nights that I would work till the wee hours of the morning, finally getting polished guitars. And I would set necks, glue on bridges for 10 guitars, come in the next morning, do final assembly on 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 guitars, drop them in boxes so that Friday UPS could come by and ship them out. And Kurt would be gone. There was a couple times when he was gone. I remember one time I said, he's like, I'm way out here. I was thinking of coming back. I'm like, don't come back. There's nothing to come back to. If you don't stay out there and sell guitars, there's nothing good going on here. Stay out there and find another person to buy another guitar. And then one time I called him and said, we just have to. It reminded me of the Rothchild call when I called you from up there. And I just said, we've got to end it with these guys. It doesn't look good. And then I said, it's time for you and me to move on from Steve. We just have to do that.
So Bob and I had realized that like in the first year that we saw things eye to eye and Steve didn't, but we thought we could live with that. I mean, we started this business and then it just, got worse and worse and, came to a head, and I'm sure equally frustrating for Steve as it was for us. So yeah, we got to, by 82, we got to that point where we'd accumulated unsold guitars again. We made the call to Arnold and Morgan to buy a bunch at a steep discount. Bob even offered to go out and cook Thanksgiving dinner for him. And I remember I was running an error or something, and I came back and driving in and parking in front of the shop, and Bob's like that. Yeah, we got the deal. He's going to take the guitars. So, and what that meant, and Bob had a lot of foresight on this. He said, you know what? We're going to be back in the same shape if you don't get out there and be selling guitars. So I left in October of 82 and went all the way to Maine and back. I mean, I was all over the place.
He doesn't have to retire to take that trip to Maine.
I mean, I was all over. And I mean, I went to New York City, and I was in Boston, up to Maine and Detroit. I mean, I went over to Windsor, Ontario on Thanksgiving because I could sell guitars there because it wasn't Thanksgiving in Windsor, Ontario. Came back, went to a Denny's, and they were out of turkey. So I couldn't have Thanksgiving dinner that year. But Bob and I would be talking, and I was really encouraged and optimistic because, you get out and see the stores, like, it's pretty easy. We make guitars, show them to people. They like them. You sell them, you collect the money.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, before that, it was like impossible. There were always so many problems. You could never see through it, but it got very, very simple. And occasionally I'd sell the samples, and Bob would ship more samples to me to a store, and I'd pick them up, and we'd talk on the phone. And Bob was like, man, it's bad around here. And, trying to get, we're all encouraged, but trying to get the guitars made, and things came to a head then. And I sold the last of my samples to Alan Levin at Washington Music Center. This is around the end of 82.
Wow. Yeah.
That was in December.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started driving home, got into Nashville, started snowing, checked into a hotel, and watched the San Diego Chargers beat the crap out of the 49ers. Anyway, I saw them win, which was really fun. It was still
and rare too.
Still Dan Fouts. Back then. So they had Air Coryell, they were a good team.
Yep.
Then I made it all the way back. I had all those checks, and Bob and I met. We're like, okay, we're going to have to go out and get an attorney. Yeah. So we talked with Gary Anderson, and he recommended Carl Ingwalson.
That's right.
And we met with Carl Ingwalson, and that really didn't go anywhere. And we switched gears really quickly. And how did we find Ed Arledge anyway?
You heard of them. You researched it. All I know is you're like, I'm hiring the best attorneys in town. Kurt likes buying the best of stuff because he thinks that it's going to work. The people that are the best, he hires good people, and he finds good people, and he stretches, and it works out for him. Mm-hmm. He's like, I'm gonna call up this company, Loose Forward, Hammerlin and Scripps, and he calls. He's like, they're going to be expensive, but they could get it done somehow. Ed Arledge, he's general business attorney, good old boy from Texas. We were waiting for Carl to call us back. He wasn't calling us back. We hired a new attorney while we're waiting for a phone call. Ed calls and says, yeah, boys, what's your partnership agreement? We had a partnership agreement. We had a buy-sell agreement.
We need to talk about that too.
We should talk about that. And we said, well, we owe him $30,000. And he's like, can you get 15? Can you each get 15? We're like, oh, he goes, no, that's what you got to do. That's your agreement. Come up with the money. And he goes, the biggest impact we're going to have on them is when they see my letterhead. They're going to read the letterhead and see who we are, and that this thing's going to get done. Next day, a relative died. His mother, grandmother. His dad died. He's like, sorry, I got to go home to Texas to bury my dad. We're like, oh, we're starting all over. Still handled the whole thing. And we were feeling like we're going to lose the whole company, like the attorney that Steve has is going to tear the whole thing down, split it all up, even though we had a clear-cut buy-sell agreement, and we were just following those rules. Ed put it to bed. We both got our money. We went and borrowed our money from relatives, and we paid him off, and it was over. It was over in a couple of days, and that Ed was our business attorney until he retired. Yeah,
we had just finished paying off the money we owed from buying the shop in the first place, so we had to borrow more money. But yeah, we had a partnership agreement. We talked about that last time. Ken Wood, the attorney, drafted it for us, and then I became aware somehow that we needed to have a buy-sell agreement. So, and I don't remember if Ken Wood drafted that or not. Probably. In the event, one of us dies or something happens, you have to have a mechanism there you have to establish a value and have a mechanism to buy out the interest of the person who died or is leaving, or else you have to liquidate, and that would be the end of the business. Yeah, that'd be the end. So I thought it was important. And that was a struggle to figure out what the business was worth. We were doing about $100,000 a year, not making any money.
8 years, $100,000 a year.
$100,000 a year. And so we had to establish a value for it. And Steve was like, well, this is all my truth. This is my life, what I'm going to do. So he was like, sky's the limit what it might be worth. And Bob is super pragmatic. Bob's like, well, what good does that do if something happened and we need to use this agreement if you can't afford to buy the other guy out? It needs to be something realistic not only in terms of the value, but to actually be a tool to use to buy somebody out.
And this discussion is years before we bought Steve out, not weeks.
Yeah, years. And we established $100,000 as the value for.
So we needed 33,000 or something like that.
And somehow he was 30 then.
Okay, so the numbers are weird, but we started out with 35 him, 35 Steve, 30% me.
Right.
And it came to pass that I owned this little house. I had a little bit of equity in it. We needed money. And so I borrowed $9,000, a second mortgage on my home to get $7,500. They took $1,500 in points on that. Can you believe that? I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't have good credit. And it was a scam. And so I had either $7,000 or $7,500. I invested in the business and I bought 3% of yours and 3% of Steve's or something like that. And so the percentages changed. And when it was all done, I think I owned 51% of the company and Kurt owned 49. And then because we split Steve's stuff. And
after we bought him out, you mean?
Yeah, after we bought him out. And then we were, I don't know, 3 days into it, a week into it, got past that. And then Kurt says, hey, is there any way I can buy, 1% and we could be 50-50? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's be 50-50. I don't want 1% more than you. I want us both to be do or die. And so we became 50-50 partners then.
Well, it's a great glimpse into the early 80s, right? I know there were some other things that went on.
That was the beginning of 83 when we then bought him out.
And I'll just throw in 79, I think Saturday Night Fever hit the theaters and nobody wanted to buy an acoustic guitar after that.
The acoustic guitar market was strong. It peaked when you guys got up and going, but when the 80s hit, it crashed. And I'd like us to delve into that next time.
We can do that.
That was a whole different challenge.
Well, 82 was probably the low point for guitars, and Steve was still a partner then. I mean, Martin was hardly making anything. Fender was hardly making anything. Because you had the Saturday Night Fever phenomenon, which was recorded music rather than live music in clubs. And right on the heels of that was the sampling synthesizer, right?
Yep.
And you go to the show and sequential circuits and their giant booth and all that. So
Early drum machines.
Guitar was not popular. And it wasn't until mid to late 80s you'd even hear like acoustic guitar on a soundtrack for anything. The Wonder Years, Snuffy Walden. That's when you started hearing it, but it was like gone. Acoustic guitar was gone.
But that, on our next episode, we can talk about how that helped Taylor Guitars become what we are today.
Yep.
That disaster got turned into a benefit.
Yep.
Love it. Let's do that.
Right on.
So did that answer your last question?
What was your last question?
I do have one more question.
Okay.
You guys fought really hard in the early days. How much of that influenced and stayed with you all the way till today? That fighter brand mentality.
All the way up till yesterday.
Yeah.
When we're making decisions about what are we going to do, what are we going to do about investing into our company and growing when we're recording this, of course, we're coming off the heels of the stay-at-home expenditures that people made into acoustic guitars and other things like that. And we don't want Taylor to be like a Peloton or something like that. And we're not. It's a different thing, But we feel a little bit of headwinds in the market right now. You feel a little bit slow down, and maybe your first impression is to hunker down, not spend some money. But we have plans. And so we're going to proceed with the things we're going to do and create that future. And of course, we have a whole company now of hundreds of people that have, it's in their DNA, it's in their workaday world to make things happen, and they do it willingly. And of course, we're 100% employee owned now. So there's even a pep in their step, even though they did it before we were employee owned. So we do have that fighting spirit. It makes sense. And we've learned along the way that you can't win if you don't play. You're not going to gain market share if you don't make the guitars. You got to invest to create a future. You can't just hang out where you are. You have to invest. You have to take some risks. There are times when it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, we've been through so many tough situations, in our careers that we know we have a lot of confidence that we can come up with good ideas and come up with solutions, to push forward.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't lose any sleep over times, even if it seems like it could be a war or anything. I don't go home and tell my wife about it or think about it. I just have a lot of confidence we'll figure it out.
Remember,
we're smart. We have good people in the company.
Mm-hmm.
I can picture us, you and me, sitting in that little office in Lemon Grove in those first years that we were just talking about in the last hour and a half. And I said, you know what, Kurt, right now, this very day, there are probably a group of people over at Yamaha trying to think of the next thing to do, trying to be smart. And who says they're smarter than you and me? Who says? I can't remember what we were talking about, but I said, let's do this. And you're like, yeah, let's do it. They're not smarter than us. We can be smart for free. It doesn't cost anything to be smart. Let's make a good decision and let's do it. So
yeah, it's good not to get too comfortable and feel insulated from things. You want to feel the pressures of things, so that you're forced to be challenged.
Funny analogies, but yesterday had an email about koa trees we're planting, and the person in charge of growing them are saying, we've put all these out there and it's really great. We have these seedlings, and where we do it, there's a really good wind that blows. And they said, which is really great for hardening off those saplings, meaning making them stiff. If they don't experience any wind, they're just limp. They fall over. But as they're growing, they call it hardening off. I think we've been hardened off from a lot of wind.
A little bit of resistance is good for us.
Yeah, it's
sometimes a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Well, thanks, guys. This has been great again. And I'm really looking forward to the next segment that we do. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks, Dave.